I'd like to welcome you here this evening. Thank you for attending. It is our great privilege to have as our guest speaker this evening Mr. Pavel Palazhchenko, who is currently with the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow, but previously he served as an international conference translator for the USSR and the Russian Federation, and worked from 1985 until 1991 as the chief English interpreter for Mikhail Gorbachev, president of the USSR, and also Eduard Shevardnadze, who was the foreign minister of the USSR. So Mr. Palazhchenko was present in all of the meetings with Presidents Reagan and Bush the Elder to discuss questions of Russian-American relations. So, and he continues to this day to work with President Gorbachev, and I think he will be speaking about very, very recent events in that connection. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Pavel Palazhchenko.
Okay, I think I'll be speaking, using the microphone. Thank you for coming. The title of this talk is Negotiations to End the Cold War. And as Michael has said, indeed, I had the privilege of participating in those negotiations. And the Cold War did end. It's an interesting question which Ambassador Matlock, unfortunately, is not here, often discusses, is when did the Cold War end? But anyway, we all understand that it did end, that things like the unification of Germany, the drastic reduction of nuclear weapons, the defeat of Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait, all of those things wouldn't have been possible in a Cold War. So the Cold War ended sometime between 89 and 91. And as I said, yes, I had the privilege of participating in those negotiations, which I believe hold important lessons for now and for the future. So I will be trying to talk about that. But let me start by saying that the phrase, the Cold War, is in a way a metaphor. And that metaphor, as all metaphors, as all images are, is not very precise. The idea that the Cold War is a constant state of tensions and balancing on the brink of a real war is really not correct. So the period of the Cold War included the efforts to make sure that the Cold War does not actually degenerate into a hot war. And that is something that was part of the diplomacy of that period. So there were a lot of things that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union, the main participants in the Cold War, should be proud of. Things like dirty tricks, things like trying constantly in various parts of the world to undermine the positions and the influence of the other side. And very often, as we know, the victims of this struggle, of this kind of confrontation, were people in those third countries in many regions. The tradition, so to say, was that if the Soviet Union supports one side in a particular regional conflict, then the United States supports the other side, and vice versa. So that was the bad side of the Cold War, the arms race, the nuclear arms race in particular, particularly in the 60s and 70s, when tens of thousands of nuclear weapons were added to the arsenals of the major nuclear powers, the USSR and the US. That too was one of the terrible aspects of the Cold War. But at the same time, as I said, the diplomats and also the military on both sides were working to try to make sure that there are certain rules of behavior, that there are certain limits to what both sides can do in order to behave rationally, in order to make sure that there is no real war. They really fully understood what, particularly a nuclear war, between the major powers could mean. So that was, I think, one of the aspects of the Cold War that is often overlooked. As I said, it also included efforts to prevent a nuclear war, to prevent a military conflict between the USSR and the United States. But it was definitely in 1985 that negotiations started to end the Cold War. And as I said, I participated in those negotiations, and I believe that there are lessons to be learned from those negotiations. We started in 1985. Before 1985, before Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, President Reagan said a couple of times that I wanted to engage Soviet leaders, but they kept dying on me. And this was not very diplomatic, but in a way it was true, because Reagan was elected in 1980. In 1982, Leonid Brezhnev dies. Then his successor, Yuri Andropov, dies in 1983. No, in 1984, in March 1984. And another very old and sick man is elected the General Secretary of the Central Committee in the Soviet Union, and that was Konstantin Chernenko. That name is almost forgotten. He was the Soviet leader for a little more than just 1 year. So 3 elderly Soviet leaders die in succession, and as Reagan said, indeed, he had no interlocutor with whom to discuss those things, because Brezhnev during his final years, Andropov during his year in power, and Chernenko during his year were people who were very ill and who would have problem actually handling negotiations. Would have been difficult even to arrange for an exchange of official visits. So Reagan certainly was not a very diplomatic person. He said in 1982 that there is an evil empire, and you know what that evil empire is. All of those things, of course, were not very conducive to negotiations. When Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary in March 1985, Reagan finally had an interlocutor in Moscow who was ready to engage, who was ready to negotiate. But even so, arranging and organizing the first summit in 6 years between the Soviet leader and the US president was not easy. The Cold War created a kind of rules of engagement and maneuvering to hold those summits in a way that would give a kind of propaganda advantage to each side. That is to say, to one of the sides. Each side wanted to use the summit diplomacy to its advantage. There was, I think, less of it, fortunately, during the preparation of the Geneva summit than during the preparation of previous summits. Ultimately, it was agreed that the first meeting would be mostly a get-acquainted meeting, but at the same time, a broad review of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, including arms control, including the regional conflicts in which both countries were involved on different sides of the conflict, and all the other issues of bilateral relations. So they meet in Geneva, halfway from the United States to the Soviet Union, at a halfway point. They meet in Geneva, and what is happening during the very first one-on-one meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev? It starts with an exchange of pleasantries. It goes well. They both express the intent to finally put the relationship between the nuclear superpowers back on track and to negotiate on all issues. Then, at some point, an exchange of, I would say, mutual accusation begins. For example, Reagan says that, well, Marxism-Leninism, which is the basis of your ideology, is something that is the cause of many problems in the world, because Marxism-Leninism assumes that all countries should ultimately be communist, and that's why we have this expansionism, that's why you are imposing your ideology on other countries, and so on. Gorbachev tried to respond somewhat jokingly, saying that the President of the United States should not think that I wake up at night thinking about what other country I should make a Marxist-Leninist country and where I would impose communism. That's not my intention, and you should be sure that that is not the intention of the Soviet Union. And fortunately, that ended that kind of exchange, because this kind of bickering obviously does not create a good atmosphere. And I must say that the subsequent conversation, which I interpreted, went a lot better, and it was a conversation where they did conduct a review of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was quite substantive. President Reagan, as you might know, was not very big on substance. He was more a kind of intuitive politician. He also had a group of people around him, including Secretary of State George Shultz, who gave him the kind of support that he needed in terms of the substance of the negotiations. But as I said, he conducted the negotiations in a rather cordial manner, and he did not continue to talk about these ideological things like Marxism, Leninism. So the negotiations were put on a good track, and they continued, and there was one question that was to be decided by the two leaders, and that is, what would be the outcome? What would be the, perhaps, statement that they would make together? And the position of the US delegation prior to the summit, when the State Department and the Foreign Ministry were discussing what the summit would produce, the position of the US side was that we do not need a joint communique, a joint statement, because those joint statements are normally long, they're not interesting, they do not change much, it's just rhetoric, etc. But interestingly, during the summit, Reagan and Shultz both said that, well, we maybe should try and do this common statement. Maybe we should try and do this joint communique. And I don't know what changed that position, but I think it was a very interesting turning point in that summit. Because they started working on it, and at the working level, so to say, the level of deputy foreign minister and members of the delegation, they started to put together something that the two presidents could approve, and that the two presidents would then present to the world as the outcome of their negotiations. And at one point, it was the Soviet side that proposed that the statement should include the words that had been often uttered by President Reagan, that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, that the nuclear war is unacceptable. And they also proposed to add another phrase, that the two sides will not seek military superiority. And perhaps not surprisingly, Reagan liked it. Reagan liked it, and when it was shown to him, the first page of that draft communique, he said, well, we should continue, and they worked overnight, and finally they presented to the two leaders the joint communique that included that particular statement, the statement about nuclear war being unacceptable, and also a number of other points on regional conflicts and bilateral relations, and the summit culminated in the adoption of that joint communique. So, talking about the lessons of our first steps in ending the Cold War, I would say that that is an interesting lesson, that things that look like they're not realistic, that one side totally rejects in the beginning, they can be made acceptable. And what made, I think, this acceptable to Reagan is that his favorite phrase about nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, that phrase was included in the communique. So they made that joint statement, and the spirit of Geneva, as the media called it, the spirit of Geneva began to change the atmosphere in the bilateral relationship and in the world. The problem, however, was that in the talks about INF, the intermediate range nuclear missiles, and START, the strategic offensive arms, it was not seen that there's been a change of the atmosphere. The talks were proceeding at a snail's pace. The talks were going nowhere. The changes in the positions of both sides still were insignificant, and they were far apart on the most important issues, the issues of arms reduction and arms control. Also, a number of other things were happening, and by the way, I can tell you that they were happening not just in 1986, right after the Geneva summit, but even in 87 and 88. Things like spy scandals, things like the entry of US naval ships in Soviet territorial waters, things like mutual allegations of bugging the embassies in both countries. The US accused the Soviet Union of bugging the newly built building of the US embassy in Moscow. And the Soviet Union showed some listening devices that were installed in the Russian buildings here. So there was a lot of unpleasantness throughout this. And I think the great merit, and very much to the credit of Gorbachev and Reagan, is that they did not allow those perhaps inevitable things, and not just disagreements, but, as I say, scandals and unpleasantness. They did not allow that to distract them from their main goal, which was really to normalize relations, to move from confrontation to cooperation. But as I said, there were plenty of those episodes that, with perhaps other leaders being in charge, could have scuttled the negotiations, could have resulted in a breakdown of the negotiations, or at least lengthy pauses and breaks in the process of negotiating. So the other lesson that I think we can learn from that period is that there are objectives and goals in the negotiations that should be pursued. that should be achieved ultimately, and negotiators and leaders, which is more important than negotiators, should not allow them to be distracted by those episodes, by those scandals, by that kind of unpleasantness from those goals, from those objectives. This is, I think, one of the things for which we really must be grateful to those leaders. The Cold War, during the first years of their engagement, was still very much on, and many of the tricks and kinds of behavior typical of the Cold War were still continuing. So not to allow to be distracted from the goals and achievements of the negotiations to continue. But as I said, things were not, did not look very nice in the mostly in 1986, and so Gorbachev proposed in the summer of 1986 that without, again, waiting for the official visits, in order to reconsider the situation, and particularly in arms control negotiations, that the two leaders should meet again at a halfway point, and he proposed different possibilities, including Reykjavik, Iceland, which is almost exactly halfway between Moscow and Washington, to meet again to review the entire relationship and to give a boost to the negotiations on nuclear arms reductions. Initially, it was supposed that it would be just the two leaders and a very small group of advisors. Then it so happened that the delegations were larger than initially expected, and so when they met in a small house in Reykjavik that the government of Iceland offered for the negotiations, it turned out that the building, just 2 floors, a small house looking like a country house, that it was too small for both delegations. And so I remember the negotiators sometimes having to talk near a bathroom or a staircase or something like this. It did look a little funny and even ridiculous. The room where Gorbachev and Reagan were having those negotiations was barely enough for them and the 2 foreign ministers, Secretary of State Schultz and Minister Shevardnadze, 2 interpreters. So, I mean, it was much smaller than this one, for example. And it was like from here to this door, maybe a little more. So, in that small room, the 2 leaders discussed the issues of nuclear arms reduction. Gorbachev made proposals that the Politburo, the leadership of the Soviet Union, had approved. The proposals that contained important concessions to the United States, concessions that were realistic, that did not harm the security of the Soviet Union, but that we believed should be of interest to the American side in those negotiations. So he did not come to Reykjavik empty-handed. He had realistic proposals that could move the negotiations off the ground. And Reagan and Schultz sensed this, and so they asked, both leaders asked experts on both sides to hold negotiations at night, and they did work not overnight, but until rather late at night, like until maybe 11 or 12 o'clock. And they reviewed all the arms control issues and agreed on a framework. So it turned out that the idea of meeting halfway and reconsidering the entire arms control agenda was a good one, because they were able to agree on quite a few things. And even though no agreement was actually signed or concluded in Reykjavik, it was an important summit in 2 respects. First of all, both leaders agreed that the goal of the negotiations ultimately should be a world without nuclear weapons, which is important. Reagan had this kind of aversion of nuclear weapons, and Gorbachev and Reagan shared that. You know, other leaders believed that nuclear weapons are a realistic part of the strategic landscape, that basically nuclear deterrence is something without which the world cannot be stable, particularly the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union. Whereas both Reagan and Gorbachev were, I would say, less involved with that kind of nuclear deterrence philosophy and nuclear deterrence ideology. Both of them just regarded nuclear weapons as really genocidal. And so the reaffirmation of the goal of a world without nuclear weapons at that level, at the presidential level, was, in my opinion, extremely important. But secondly, they also agreed on what I call the framework. The framework of agreements both on START and on INF, both on strategic weapons and intermediate range weapons. They didn't sign that framework because there were differences which turned out to be insurmountable on the Strategic Defense Initiative on missile defense. Missile defense is part of the entire strategic equation. That's very important to bear in mind. Particularly for the Soviet side, you cannot long-term reach an agreement on strategic weapons if the ballistic missile defense is not included in the equation. Because under some circumstances and with certain levels of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile defense can be very destabilizing. Because if one side strikes, if one side delivers the first strike and then expects that in the second strike, in the strike that would be retaliatory from the other side, it would be able to intercept a lot of the incoming missiles, that may create an incentive for the first strike. Just to repeat, basically strategic stability means that there shouldn't be incentive for the first strike. And as I said, if the first strike is made and much of the strategic capability of the other side is destroyed in that first strike, then even the retaliatory strike could then be intercepted by the missile defense of the side that delivers the first strike. That's very destabilizing. Gorbachev insisted that the idea of strategic defense, which would be a kind of astrodome that would defend the entire territory of the United States from a possible retaliatory strike, that's very destabilizing, and that we cannot talk about reducing nuclear weapons while at the same time building ballistic missile defenses. And for Reagan, of course, the Strategic Defense Initiative was his baby, his favorite child, and he said, well, we cannot agree to any limitation on missile defense. And both men, even though they shared the rejection of nuclear weapons, had to disagree on this. Nevertheless, the framework for a 50% reduction of strategic offensive arms and an the elimination of intermediate range missiles, that is missiles with a range of from 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. So that framework was agreed. And even though nothing was signed, and even though the summit was regarded as a failure by international media, it was ultimately a breakthrough. Because once a framework is agreed, that affects the defense planning, the weapons planning, the strategic planning of both sides. And the military in both sides took that as the plan for the future which meant that the buildup of nuclear arms that continued throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, that buildup would end. So that was the greatest achievement of Reykjavik, and so here comes the third lesson. And the third lesson is that even though it may look like the negotiations have not produced an agreement that is signed, that is concluded, and then ratified, it's important to agree in general terms on some kind of a framework so that subsequent negotiations produce a treaty that is binding, a treaty that is signed, a treaty that is ratified. And this is exactly what happened in December 1987, when the first treaty, as part of that framework, was signed in Washington. Gorbachev came to Washington in December 1987, and the INF treaty was signed. That same treaty that the Trump administration now says Russia has violated, and therefore the United States would withdraw from that treaty, as it was announced today. The United States is giving Russia 60 days to correct the violations. If those violations are not corrected, then the US will withdraw. A kind of ultimatum, and in my view, ultimatums is not the best way to conduct international relations. Anyway, the INF Treaty, whatever its future is going to be, whether it will cease to exist as a result of the US withdrawal, or perhaps some kind of compromise would be reached, the INF Treaty has worked well for the security of the Soviet Union, for the security of Russia, for the security of the United States, and for the security of Europe, where all of those missiles were deployed. So that success, I think, will not be negated, even if the treaty, as I said, ceases to exist as a result of US withdrawal. So the next lesson is that with patience and perseverance, with negotiations, patient negotiations, ultimately a result is achieved. And as I said, the INF Treaty was the first such result. Unfortunately, with the strategic offensive arms, negotiations dragged on for quite a long time. Reagan, as we know from the memoirs of Secretary of State Schultz, wanted that treaty, the treaty on 50% reduction of strategic arms, to be signed on his watch. But, as I said, unfortunately, even though Schultz wanted that too, and he fought within the interagency process for that treaty was only signed by the late President Bush, the first President Bush, and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991. So the first treaty signed in 87. The second treaty was signed in 91. Also in 1991, Bush and Gorbachev exchanged letters in which they expressed mutual intent to significantly reduce the tactical nuclear weapons. Those are the weapons with a range below 500 kilometers, like 300 miles. And under that arrangement, under those presidential initiatives, the tactical nuclear weapons were eliminated. Many tactical nuclear weapons were eliminated. By some estimates, up to 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons on both sides. So today, the total number of nuclear weapons in the arsenals of Russia and the United States is a fraction of what it was at the height of the Cold War. By some estimates, it's 1/6, 15% of the numbers that existed during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War. That is also, I think, a great achievement, even though today we still have the arsenals of nuclear weapons, including strategic nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, strategic bombers. We will still have the numbers of nuclear weapons that are unacceptably high. Thousands, still thousands. That is the kind of power that can destroy human civilization, unfortunately, still. But nevertheless, it's, as I said, it's a fraction of what it was during the Cold War. So, what is the lesson for today, now that the relationship between the Soviet Union, between Russia, sorry, and the United States is at a very low point? It's the most dismal relationship, it's the most alarming kind of situation that I've seen in decades, frankly. Some people say it's even worse than the Cold War. What is the lesson of the Cold War? First of all, I would say that we have to be realistic, we have to understand the centrality of nuclear issues and arms control for the relationship between Russia and the US. It's not a good situation. This centrality of arms control, the centrality of the nuclear issues for the relationship is not good, but realistically we have to accept it. I would have preferred a broad-based relationship where the economy, commerce, mutual investment, cooperation on global and regional issues would be central. But that's not the case. Unfortunately, in the 1990s and afterwards, that is to say after the end of the Cold War, both countries have not been able to build an economic foundation for their relationship. Our trade is minimal. It's a fraction of the volumes of trade between, let's say, the United States and China, between the United States and the European Union. And that is not a good thing. It's also not good that the United States and Russia find themselves on different sides in some of the regional conflicts, such as Syria. So again, realistically, we have to accept that probably the only area where just the fact that the two nations still have the numbers of weapons that can destroy the world, just that fact should be sufficient incentive for both sides to sit down and start discussing these central issues of nuclear arms and how to reduce them, how not to allow a new arms race to reignite and to become uncontrollable. Unfortunately, we have not seen such negotiations over the past few years. The election of Donald Trump was unrealistically seen by many people in Russia as an opening, as a possibility to rebuild the relationship with the United States. That has not happened. I must say very frankly that I do not think that it will be happening within the next couple of years. So what can be done? Today, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the USSR, and George Shultz, the former Secretary of State of the United States, published an article in the Washington Post calling for starting informal negotiations between arms control experts, veteran diplomats, veteran military, and former leaders to discuss strategic stability and the path to resuming arms control negotiations. Initially at an informal expert level, so that even during the current deadlock in official relations between the United States and Russia, we could perhaps lay the groundwork, the foundations for future agreements between Russia and the United States. I think this is an excellent idea. I believe that there are plenty of people on both sides who could engage in this kind of informal discussions, and I believe that this could produce something that the current administration and the next one should consider. There are still good minds in both countries. There is objectively a need for some kind of framework, I would call it again a framework, for the future, which could then be filled out and which could subsequently result in arms control agreements. The need for such agreements is enormous. The military, the defense industry, the designers of weapons are people with very fertile imagination. They have been thinking and sometimes testing things like hypersonic warheads, things like nuclear torpedoes, things like new types of nuclear missiles, etc. And that could very well result in an arms race that could be not only costly but also dangerous. So the need for negotiating on strategic stability and arms control is very obvious. I think it is obvious to people here. I think it is obvious to people in Russia. And I do believe that this idea of first discussing possible paths forward informally at an expert level and then moving toward formal negotiations and possibly agreements, that this is a good idea and I hope it will work. So I've tried to outline, to describe to you what happened. I have shared with you some suggestions that could perhaps be useful in the coming months and years in order to begin changing this current situation. And I would say in conclusion, before I take your questions, that I believe in the future of relations between Russia and the US. I do understand realistically that over the past few years, trust has been undermined. Rebuilding trust will be an extremely difficult task that will take years. We cannot today be, starry-eyed optimistic about the prospects of the overall relationship. But what I do believe is that if we move forward on nuclear issues and arms control, we can create a better atmosphere to address all the other issues that have piled up in the US-Russian relationship. We can begin rebuilding trust that is needed in relations between major powers and that is lacking now. So over the longer term, I believe that we can be reasonably optimistic. We do not have any other choice, frankly. We cannot afford the current situation. And given that most of you here are young people, you have plenty of time to maybe contribute to this work, but certainly to see, I think, a normalization, an improvement, and then again, movement from confrontation to cooperation, to partnership. This is what happened several years ago, 30 years ago. This is what can, I believe, happen again. Thank you.